Good, everyone. Welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, I feel like we shouldn't do this every time US President Donald Trump opens his mouth, but sometimes you sort of feel like you have to, and today is one of those days. Been a lot of reaction over the last 24 to 48 hours with some of the president's commentary over, look, is the US headed for a recession or not? He was asked pretty bluntly, and he didn't give a straightaway, nah, we're not heading there. Some of the tone around, resets and from some of his staff that, this might be necessary and it might be sort of, the detox that the economy needs seem to be maybe not agreement with the recession coming through for the US, but certainly not that the White House was trying to move away from that idea. Maybe not happy to embrace it, but not sort of trying to get away from that hug either. That's pretty challenging on the economic front for quite a bit, certainly after the president's or after the election happened. Markets were in a really strong sort of bullish mood. Expectations were that Trump would come through with a lot of pro-growth moves, and that would, boost what was an already pretty hot US economy, and that would almost go through into the wider global mix as well. Just more and more and more spending and what have you. Everyone probably in hindsight was going and ignoring the more challenging economic moves, although we were certainly talking about them a bit more. You've now seen that, tariffs are still very firmly in place. And in fact, some of the counter actions around tariffs and the argy-bargy that's creating has exacerbated that sort of risk even more. You had that talk of recession over the last couple of days in the US. You've now had tariffs that are, going on Canada. There's now additional tariffs coming through on the likes of steel and aluminium. Across the board, there's a very big tone that seems to be coming out of the US of sort of tariffs come hell or high water a little bit. So, with all of that, the markets have certainly not reacted positively to that news and the risk around the global economy, right?
No, they've gone from thinking Trump is pro-growth to precisely the opposite, and that share market really has fallen quite substantially over the last couple of weeks, reversing all the gains that it had made post-election, and then some as well. Real big shift there in terms of market sentiment, both in the US, of course, and around other countries as well. And that's the critical thing, right? Sure, this trade war as it stands between the US, China, Mexico, Canada. It has bad effects, particularly for the likes of Canada and Mexico, has bad effects for American economic growth. But the reality is that the big slowdown, a significant slowdown in America is going to be felt with a sort of rippling out through the rest of the world economy as well. And so you're looking at weaker demand conditions that China will be facing, who, let's be honest, they've got their own problems with economic growth anyway, without adding America's trade war into the mix and slower growth in America in there as well. You're seeing it reflected in European markets. And again, Europe wasn't going to be growing particularly fast anyway. And it is coming down through to this part of the world where both Australia and New Zealand are finding themselves exposed to the global slowdown, both directly in terms of where we trade with America, but also, of course, indirectly in the flow-on effects that come through China. So there's a lot there for markets to digest, both on the growth front, but also, of course, on the inflation front. When you look at America, if you're putting these tariffs in place, things are going to cost more in America. They're going to cost more for households, but also for businesses who are producing stuff that's made out of with some imported component to it, whether it's electricity or whether it's steel or aluminium, whatever it might be. That is going to cost more as well. And so there are concerns that we're going to have the worst of both worlds, sort of great old 70s stagflation coming back, where we've got little or no economic growth and yet considerable price pressures as well. And of course, we've seen the Federal Reserve reacting to that recently by going, we don't know where things are going. I don't think anybody knows where things are going at the moment. The Fed's going, we don't know. And so we're not sure whether we should be cutting interest rates or raising them. So we're just going to hold tight and see how things pan out. Share markets, on the other hand, are going, this is all bad and it's all heading in one direction at the moment.
Oh, and it's sort of, I think it's important to state just how bad this has been. The last couple of days, some of the US markets overall combined have lost 1.7 trillion in value. The entire 3.4 trillion in value that was added over the last couple of months since the US elections, completely gone. You're not just talking about people who have now seen that their growth in their investments and that has turned slightly worse. It's that it's actually gone negative. People have, on paper, sure, lost money and like sometimes lost some pretty significant dollar values coming through there. And that's the challenge. New Zealanders who are looking at their KiwiSaver, that are looking at their, portfolio investments and similar, like it's a bloodbath at the moment, and it's generally across the board. So there is a real worry there. I mean, broader, when we think about this from a trade picture, and you talked about the sort of worries around economic growth and similar, and that's obviously quite a key concern. I mean, what sort of things are a bit more in the more direct firing line for New Zealand? Where could there be sort of more an effect on product? And again, I mean, you talked about the fact that, European growth is likely to be lower, Chinese growth is likely to be lower, US growth, which was, in a very strong position to start with, is likely to be lower. Who do we trade with now? I mean, both on the product side and also the country side, there's some big sort of questions for us to grapple with.
Yeah, there's not a lot of options there when you think about it from a country point of view. And it does reflect that the US has been the engine of world growth over the last 4 or 5 years as Chinese growth has slowed. So there's not a lot of alternatives if America is going to be going backwards. From a product perspective, look, New Zealand, of course, hasn't had tariffs imposed on us yet, but Trump has talked recently about imposing those tariffs on all agricultural imports heading into the country. And so from a New Zealand perspective, when you look at that, wine would be right at the top of the list. About 35% of our wine exports go to the US. Meat as well. It's a similar figure of meat exports go to the US. And beef, it's much more concentrated. Americans with low cow numbers running around in the US and still wanting to eat their hamburgers. So they need to get the beef from somewhere. But, it will be costing them more, and they'll probably be wanting to eat less of it as the price goes up. Beyond that, there's a few other surprising categories. I mean, we has seen a significant proportion of mechanical machinery, electrical machinery, and also medical equipment exports to the US as well. Then they're significant enough in the grand scheme of things that you don't want to be ignoring them either. And so, there's several sectors across New Zealand where exports potentially directly affected by tariffs. And of course, that's before you start to take into account the demand effect, which could see commodity prices and general demand conditions lower across the board, and therefore starting to weigh on not just the sort of the volumes you're able to send overseas, but the prices you're able to get for your meat exports, but potentially for the likes of dairy, horticulture as well.
So look, very tough situation, still a huge amount of uncertainty. And I think that's what everyone's reacting to. The outlook looks worse. That's what markets are effectively pricing in with some of the pretty steep falls through in stocks and similar. But the outlook as well, people are just going, look, I just don't know where this is going to go. But if I had to take a bit of a punt at the moment, it's on the worst side of things rather than better. Also, what I'm hearing is that, with all likelihood, President Trump's Macca's order is going to get a bit more expensive if he does put some tariffs on, and that some of that good old New Zealand beef that goes through to the US is again a bit more expensive. All of that's a real challenge, I think, for the global economy, and it is the sort of thing we're going to assess sort of day by day, almost hour by hour, second by second. We can't jump at every sort of new shadow that emerges, but we've got to try and sort of figure out where this is going, because people do want to make some of those forward decisions, and likely if they don't have any stability, the decision will be, let's park it for now because it's just too tough. That's difficult, but we will continue to assess what happens, what actually comes through, what bluster is published on X, and everything in between on one of our future editions of Econ Talks.